Welcome to our chapter on social psychology. Social psychology is the study of people in groups or social situations. I want to remind everyone to watch the videos associated with this chapter. The videos can tell the stories much better than I can, I think, but just by describing it with slides, particularly the videos on Stanley Milgram's obedience to authority and Solomon Ash's conformity videos, but watch all of them. Quite interesting. Okay, we're going to start with cognitive dissonance. And this is a term that you'll hear if your ear is attuned to it. You'll hear it in the media, you see it in the paper sometimes. It's good to know what this is. So cognitive dissonance is when there is mental or emotional discomfort. We're uncomfortable. When a person has a mismatch or a conflict between two conflicting attitudes or between an attitude that conflicts with their behavior. So the theory is that when we say one thing and do another, or we have two opposing beliefs, that it makes us uncomfortable. And the theory predicts that people will be motivated to reduce the dissonance and make everything consistent. So as you see in this graphic here, you can have an attitude or a behavior. We just label them one. And if it's inconsistent with an attitude or a second behavior, we feel cognitive dissonance. So as an example would be the belief that smoking is really unhealthy, but on the other hand, a person smokes. So that's inconsistent, and people will accuse us of being hypocrites and so on when we are not consistent in our attitudes and our behaviors, or two conflicting attitudes. So it leads to mental discomfort, and then we are motivated to resolve this. So let me continue to explain this a little bit. So let's say a belief is that smoking cigarettes is unhealthy. If you see in that blue box, that's the belief. And at the bottom in the bottom blue box, it says a person smokes cigarettes. That leads to cognitive dissonance, which is an unpleasant tension state and awareness that the belief and action are inconsistent. So we can either change our action, so smoking cigarettes is unhealthy and therefore quit smoking, or change the belief, which is that the research on smoking is really not conclusive, so I can continue to smoke cigarettes. Now, of course, the research is conclusive, but people will not believe things. And they will also rationalize, going back to Freud stuff for a minute, I'm going to die of something anyway, might as well be smoking. You've heard that, I'm sure, as well. Now, relate this to our current pandemic. What are people doing? They either know that COVID is very, very unhealthy, it's deadly, but they continue to socialize with their friends, not wear masks, go into crowds, and so on. That should create cognitive dissonance. So what do they need to do? They either need to change their action, which is to start to be more healthy and responsible, or change their beliefs, which is that COVID is not that much of a problem. And we've seen leaders in our country, particularly politicians, say these sorts of things. Yeah, it's not that big a deal. It's just like getting the flu. In spite of all evidence that over 250,000 people have died, and there are millions and millions of cases in this country, and it is not an easy disease to deal with, we still see this cognitive dissonance all the time. If you watch television news or anything like that, you see it, you hear it, and you wonder how people can rationalize their behavior. But they do that because they don't want to change what they're doing. It might also be inconsistent with their belief in personal freedom. I shouldn't have to wear a mask. No one's going to tell me what to do. Which, okay, but when not wearing the mask could put loved ones at danger, or even yourself, if you're with other people who aren't wearing masks, then it's a pretty strong reason to change your attitude and decide yeah, maybe wearing masks and maybe keeping socially distant right now is a good idea. Okay, here's another example. Cognitive dissonance. An attitude might be domestic abuse is bad and no one should put up with it, but the behavior might be I continue to stay in an abusive relationship. Now, as a therapist, I've seen this many times, especially with women. They're in love with the men who are verbally or physically abusive to them. Now, granted, sometimes people have families or they don't have a job or there's reasons to make them stay. But helping them figure this out is one of the great challenges. So how do people reduce dissonance? One way is the attitude that my partner doesn't mean to hurt me, so it's not really abuse. And again, I've really heard this. Well, he didn't mean it. Well, he was had a rough day. Well, I know he really loves me. So when that happens, the behavior is I'm not in an abusive relationship, so therefore there's no reason to leave. So the attitude is that the partner doesn't really mean it, they really do love them, and therefore it justifies staying in an abusive relationship in spite of the fact that they're showing up with bruises. So obviously a second way to reduce the cognitive dissonance would simply be to end the relationship. And of course, it's not always so easy for people. Now, there's been research on cognitive dissonance, and the most famous study took place in 1959 by Fessinger and Goldsmith. And they had two groups of students participate in a very long, boring task. I think they had to spend, I don't know if it was 30 minutes or an hour, putting little wooden pegs in tiny holes of a pegboard. Okay, so that they gave them a long, boring task to do. Then there were two groups. The first group was given $1 to tell another student who was waiting, who was actually a Confederate, that the task had been interesting. It's like, would you please tell the student waiting outside that this was an interesting task, and I'll give you $1 to do that. The second group was told that they would be given $20, or they were given $20 to tell another student that the task had been interesting. So basically, both groups were asked to lie to a waiting student. One group was given $1, one group was given $20. Okay, a week later, they bring these same students back and gave them a questionnaire, and they were asked, did you really enjoy the pegboard task? Did you like it? So which group do you think was more likely to say they enjoyed the task? The group that got $1 to lie, or the group that got $20 to lie? So take a second and think what your answer would be. Which group do you think was more likely to say they had actually enjoyed doing the pegboard? Most students say the $20 group, but actually that's not correct. The group that was paid $1 to lie were more likely to say that they liked the task. There was cognitive dissonance about lying. The $20 group, did you like the task? They said no, the task was boring. They had no dissonance about lying. So why is that? Reinforcement theory might say the $20 group was more likely to lie, but in fact it was the $1 group, because the $1 group convinced themselves that they actually liked the task. Maybe they didn't want to lie for $1. Maybe they felt bad lying, getting, as I jokingly say, you sell your soul for $1. Maybe they didn't want to do that. The $20 group knew they had lied to get the money. And so the group one reduced cognitive dissonance by convincing themselves they did enjoy the long, boring task. The second group knew they had told the lie to get the money. It was really clear. I was paid to lie. So cognitive dissonance, there's a little cartoon I saw, the lies we tell ourselves to avoid hypocrisy. We don't want to be a hypocrite, so we tell ourselves these little lies to make ourselves feel comfortable. The next topic is on social influence. Now, people live in groups. So psychology is really interesting, but it's never one person. We are influenced by everyone around us for our entire lives. So, of course, our first influences are our family and friends growing up, but there are social influencers on trends, social media, television, music, movies, books, newspapers, anything that you can run across and experience that's really has nothing directly to do with you, but oddly enough can influence our behavior. Advertising, logos, slogans, and packaging influences what we buy, and that's an entire marketing science if those of you want to go into business. Religious and political groups influence our value systems and our behavior. Authority figures have control over us much of the time, so they influence us of what we do. There are community standards, values, and groupthink. Did you vote? Do you vote? Well, if your community supports voting and your friend group supports everybody should vote, you're more likely to vote. If they don't, if the belief is it doesn't make any difference, you're probably less likely to vote. And then whose information can be believed? I recently wanted to buy an exercise piece of exercise equipment and was looking into it online, and I thought I found a pretty good. It was an exercise bike, and then I read 2 reviews of the thing, and there were only 2 reviews, and both reviews were terrible. And they said it was badly made and didn't come with the right screws and all this stuff. And right away, I decided not to buy that particular exercise bike. So why did I trust these 2 random strangers? I don't know. They made a pretty strong case. So lastly is the value and importance of critical thinking, which is something I've been trying to teach you guys since the beginning of the semester. How do you make decisions? How do you know what source of information can be believed? If you are reading a newspaper, and I hope you all read the newspaper, or follow the news online, obviously, which source do you believe? How does if you're reading a newspaper, where do they get their information from, and how do they decide what is truth? And there are journalistic standards. So if a publication is following the journalistic standards of looking at evidence, getting direct quotes, direct evidence of a particular situation, and multiple sourcing. So not just what one person says, but do 2 or 3 or more people say the same thing in reporting a situation. That carries a lot more weight than a politician who says a lot of people are saying, quote unquote. Who's saying, right? And then that gets into the internet media and badly run newspapers. A lot of people are saying, yeah, who? Based on what? So our social influences can be very, very strong. I don't think we can really even get through a day without being influenced by other people. What power do people exert over others? So it comes back to in social psychology, what influences our behaviors? What makes us change our minds and do certain things one way or another way? So these are photos that I took from the 2018 Women's March. If you haven't guessed, that's me in the black coat. And it was an amazing day. As you can see in that bottom left picture, you couldn't even move. There were so many people there. Eventually it did start moving. They had to block traffic or block foot traffic from time to time to let other vehicles down the street. But it was a great day. Did it change anything? Well, there's the social influence. Probably not so much. It felt great to go. It felt great to feel the solidarity with other people who think like I do, that women should have rights. But I don't know if it changed anything or not. Maybe it put some things on the radar in a different way. But I still think it was good to show up. And that would certainly be the case with all the Black Lives Matter protests over the country this past summer. I thought it was an incredible show of solidarity. And I think it did change people's attitudes a bit. People started to think about it in a different way. So I don't know if it changes things. We want to think so, or we wouldn't go, right? So, getting back to psychology, which authority figures do we obey and why? So here you see what looks like a boss, police officers, a politician, and maybe a parent. And why do we obey these people? What power do they have over us that we would do what they tell us to do? And that was the question that was asked and answered, at least partially, by Stanley Milgram in 1963. Now, his study was called Obedience to Authority, and this is one of the most famous and important experiments in the entire history of psychology. So you can bet there will be several test questions about this. I actually met him once. He came to a class that I was taking while I was in graduate school, and he talked about the ethics of the study that he conducted, and he had come under a lot of fire for this study, and I think you'll see why as we talk about it. So Stanley Milgram was Jewish, and in the early 1960s, it had only been, less than 20 years since the end of World War II. And he was really haunted by what the Nazis had done in World War II to round up and exterminate 6 million Jewish people. And he was haunted by what Nazi Holocaust organizer Adolf Eichmann had said in his trial for war crimes, which had just occurred in 1961. So this was, for Milgram, all fairly recent. Eichmann said, "I only followed the orders." It's like, what? How many people have said, "I only did what I was told to do. I only followed orders"? Well, so-and-so told me I was supposed to do that. So-and-so told me. The lack of personal responsibility, pushing off responsibility onto someone else who was an authority figure is an old excuse. So at what point do we stop and take responsibility for our own behavior? So back in those days, people were saying, how did this happen? How did this happen? And people were blaming, quote unquote, a German authoritarian personality. So what does that mean? They said, oh, the Germans love authority, and they have very strict rules about following orders. And so they blamed the authoritarian personality of Germans for that. And, Americans saying that, we could all make ourselves feel better, right? Like, well, I would never act that way. And that's those Germans. And it's kind of crazy because, well, as you'll see in the study, but Milgram didn't buy it. He was thinking, Germans aren't genetically different than anybody else. Like, what is it about authority that makes us do things? So why do people follow immoral orders? So he was a social psychologist, so he was convinced that situations and not personality traits would determine this. So here's this experimental method, and it's a little convoluted, so pay attention here and let's get the configuration right so you can understand the study. So the question was, would people obey an authority figure even if it meant hurting someone else? He had 40 male experimental participants in 40 trials come to Yale University, where he taught, to participate in this study. So 40, the guys would come in one at a time, okay? They were coming in one at a time. And he told people that the study was, he was studying the effect of punishment on learning and memory and memorizing pairs of words. So that was the ruse. The study was actually about obedience to authority. So the gentleman would come in the room, the study participant, and he would meet the experimenter. And you see there in the graphic, the letter E, that is the experimenter. That would be basically Stanley Milgram or his assistant. And meet another person who was told, this is who you're partnering with in this learning study. And one person was assigned the role of teacher. The other person was assigned the role of learner. But the teacher was the actual experimental participant. So that was always rigged. I guess they did a coin toss or something, but the teacher was always the experimental participant. The learner was a confederate of the experimenter. So by now you should know that confederate means like an ally or a helper of the experimenter. So here's how it looked. Look at the graphic. The teacher was sitting at a chalkboard, and wires ran into an adjoining room where the learner went into the other room and was attached to these wires. Okay, so you weren't in the same room. The teacher and learner weren't in the same room. The teacher was in the same room as the experimenter. The student was strapped in the chair. Now the learner, I said student, it's the learner, was strapped in the chair with electrodes attached to his arm. Just remember that that person was working with the experimenter, as a confederate. The teacher didn't realize that this was a person part of the study. The experimenter was the authority figure and stayed in the room with the teacher. The teacher was told to shock the learner for a wrong answer. So the idea was, I'm going to read a list of words, and then you have to remember which word goes with the cue word. It's like a multiple choice question. And then for each wrong answer, which was all predetermined and actually pre-recorded, unknown to the teacher, the person was supposed to give an electric shock to the person in the next room. There was a shock generator labeled from 15 volts to 450 volts. And you see a picture of it there, and you can see it's labeled dangerous severe shock. So for each wrong answer, the person was supposed to go up another level, another 15 volts to a higher and higher level. So the shock was supposedly becoming more severe with each wrong answer. Now, there was no actual shock delivered. The whole thing was staged. And in fact, the person in the next room wasn't even speaking. It was a recording. They had pre-recorded it. There was actually one shock delivered, which was a test shock to the teacher, so that the teacher would see what it felt like to get a 45-volt shock. And why is that significant? Because at 45 volts, you know that that's a mild shock. You know what that feels like. It's mildly painful. So you can't pretend that you didn't know that it could hurt to get shocked. And the shock generator went up to 450 volts, which is 10 times the 45-volt sample that they felt. So if you're giving somebody 450 volts of electricity, you know that it's pretty painful based on what you had just experienced as the teacher. But other than that, one test shock, no actual shock was delivered. Now, again, the responses from the so-called student in the next room or the learner were pre-recorded, and they did not actually receive any shocks, but the whole thing was acted out. So when the student complained of pain after shock or said, oh, I have a heart condition, and started yelling and screaming, or oh, let me out of here, and then they eventually went silent, the teacher would become very uncomfortable, and they usually questioned what to do. So you could imagine if it was you sitting in that chair delivering shock to a stranger, would you continue to give the shock? What would you do? And a lot of times the teacher would get very uncomfortable and turn around. Sitting with them is the authority figure or the experimenter, and said, well, he's complaining. The authority figure said one of two things. You must go on and you must complete the experiment. So what did they do? Did they stop? Did they go on? Out of the, 40 people that came in, what percentage do you think went all the way to giving 450 volts of electricity? What do you think? In fact, 65% of the participants gave the full amount of 450 volts. So that's 2/3 of the people went all the way up to the top. Now, that's pretty distressing. So if situations control what people do. Do they do an immoral act of harming another person? I mean, why? What compelled the people to continue to shock another person? So they redid the study and they took it off the Yale campus, which was, impressive and so on, like, it would be a little intimidating to go to Yale. And they moved it to a rundown kind of office in New Haven, Connecticut. They rented office space, an empty storefront. When they did that, obedience dropped to 48%. So now from about 2/3 of the people, about half the people. So the setting right there made a difference. And they did this study many, many different ways over time, many different variations of this. Whether you had the experimenter sitting in the room, the authority figure sitting in the room, or sitting in an adjacent room, speaking to them through a microphone, and so on. Like, what made compliance go up and down? One of the things that made a difference was if the teachers voiced an early firm statement of opposition to delivering shock, they were much more likely to quit. So if a person came in saying, I'm not comfortable giving somebody else shock, well, now you've got cognitive dissonance at play, right? I said I don't like doing this, so now I'm doing it. I have to quit. I have to stop because my behavior can't be inconsistent with what I just said. So it actually does help people to state their values in advance. Say it out loud. And if you're ever in a situation where you're uncomfortable about something going on, make your statement known, and it'll be much easier for you to follow what you believe in. Now, when I met Stanley Milgram, I wish I'd gotten his autograph. um, he was under fire, had been under fire for the ethics of this experiment, because people criticized it, saying, how do you make people feel if you have them in a study where they think they've delivered strong, severe shock to another individual? And of course, they really haven't, but they don't know that. What have they learned about themselves? What do they come away with being tricked in that way? And Milgram continued to defend it. He said, they learned something about themselves that's valuable, which is that they were susceptible to that level of authority pressure, even though, what would the consequences have been if they walked out? Nothing, right? You don't get paid the $4 or whatever they were going to get paid. There were no consequences for disobeying an authority figure there. But people in those days had more respect for authority figures, perhaps. And he said, you learn something in really what's a safe environment, that if you get out in the real world where there are real consequences, maybe you recognize that you shouldn't just necessarily immediately go along with an authority figure. Which kind of led to, this happened in the early 1960s, this study. And by the late 1960s, as you know, bumper stickers that said "question authority" were showing up on cars. People had this notion that we should question authority. We should not automatically do as we're told. And if you know your US history, what else was happening in the mid to late 1960s was the Vietnam War. And people started protesting the war and saying, we're not going to go to Vietnam to kill people for a war that's immoral. So there wasn't the lockstep obedience, there was questioning it. So Milgram said the disappearance of a sense of responsibility is the most far-reaching consequence of submission to authority. That is that same quote that Eichmann had said in his trial, I was only following orders. Milgram was saying we can't just follow orders, we have to question what are we being asked to do and why? What's the rationale? And then this quote on the right, Howard Zinn is a philosopher. He said, historically, the most terrible things, war, genocide, and slavery, have resulted not from disobedience, but from obedience. So you will still hear Stanley Milgram referenced. You'll hear the obedience to authority study referenced. Today, you probably couldn't run that study if it were invented today because of the ethical considerations. However, it was a beautifully designed study, and I think the contribution to social psychology and understanding what we do, why we do it, has been invaluable. So to me, the good outweighs the bad here for sure. Be sure you watch the video, which is narrated by Stanley Milgram. It's an old video, but it's still very informative, and take a look at that and understand this study. And come back for part 2.